Welcome to the Martial Arts and Life podcast with Kris Wilder.
Good day, good afternoon, good morning, good tea time. Welcome to Martial Arts and Life. I'm your host, Kris Wilder. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to talk about the 10 rules of karate, the immutable path to victory. Now, this is a book that Lawrence Kane and I authored recently. And although this might sound like it's turning into a commercial for the 10 rules of karate, it's really not. What I want to do is I want to talk to you about some aspects of this and how rules and the idea of rules and principles can assist you in your training. Now, if you want to take interest and pick up the book, absolutely, please, I would love that. But this is a little bit of the backstory, a little bit behind the curtain of how this book came to be, why it became to be, and the structure of it, and the principles that are involved in it, and the ideas that we hope to communicate. So again, not an infomercial, but a peek behind the process and a peek at the structure of what we're trying to present. When you take a look at something like this, when you start to put it together, you realize that you're putting together a lot of life experience, and you hope that somebody's going to take interest in what you have to say, and people have. We went to #1 on Amazon recently with the book in the martial arts section, and for that, there's always a deep appreciation for that. The idea that there's only 10 immutable rules of karate, well, it's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, there could be 7, there could be 8, there could be 20. Like Funakoshi, the creator of Shotokan, he has 20 precepts that he wrote down, and they are principles for the adherents of the system to align their lives, to put themselves together in a way that is useful, not only in the dojo, but also in other aspects of life. In fact, if you look at his 20 precepts, I think really only 3 of them deal directly with how one should hold their technique. You should think of your hands and feet as swords. I think that might be 17 or 18 on the list. Those Shotokan practitioners out there, feel free to correct me. I'm happy to be corrected. Many of the topics that he addresses are like how to carry oneself in an attitude on a daily basis. You read a little Stoicism, you read a little bit of Funakoshi's 20 precepts. There's a Venn diagram there. They kind of cross. Whenever I see cross-cultural things like that, the idea of ancient Greeks and immediately modern Japanese precepts coming together, you gotta believe that there's some truth there, because these things don't cross-pollinate. They stand of their own accord. You can look at Bruce Lee. I think Bruce Lee had one precept, which was the straight blast. Simple, and I know that it is brief, and you might even consider it dismissive. It's not. I just think that when you distill his work down, I think that what you find is that it's pretty straightforward, and that makes sense from where he came from, his root art, Wing Chun before it became Jeet Kune Do and so forth. We're all aware of that evolution and the things that transpired in his life. And I would say that it comes down to that, maybe one item of straight blast. But of course, there were other things that he did, like diet and exercise and his mental training. Do those fall into the title of precepts or rules of one's karate behavior or martial arts behavior? I'll leave that to you, because I don't know that there was a specific list left behind by Bruce Lee like there was by Funakoshi and other martial artists as well. The thing about rules is we look at those things and we say things like, hey, you need to follow the rules. And sometimes those rules become silly. They become insane. They eat themselves. They become that snake, that classic picture of the snake eating its own tail. It's a very famous symbol. When you look at it, you can see many times modern bureaucracy turns into that kind of thing. The classic novel Catch-22 that was made into a movie, it was that sort of thing. You can't do this, but you have to do that, but you're not supposed to, so you can't. we rail against those kinds of rules, and I think rightfully so, because they're insane and they're made fun of by comedians. I don't care if it's Jerry Seinfeld or Monty Python, or it could be the two Ronnies, and lots of other things that make these rules seem redundant and eating themselves and just quite ineffectual and stupid. Those are the rules that we rail against, the ones that we just say, that's dumb. We don't do it that way. But one of the things about rules is that rules make us better. You think about a child has to have rules or they turn into a hideous human being. Nobody wants that. The idea that the rule is designed to help build a better person, a good person, one that treats others well, is polite, is fair, kind, learning to share, all of these simple rules, and they become ingrained, and then they become part of who they are, and subsequently delightful people to be around. And that's a good thing, and that's how rules work. And let's look at just one of the chapters out of 10 rules of karate. And it's the chapter called Punches Come in Bunches. And in that chapter, there's a subsection called Chunking is Only for the Training Hall. Chunking is a way of managing time or a project. It's to take a project and to break it down into its elemental parts and then to deal with those in sequence. For those of you who are in the business world, there's a Gantt chart. I love Gantt charts. I use them. I've used them for years. And it's taking that project and working it backwards and how long is it going to take and what's the resource going to be and who's responsible at this point. What's the projected length on this? It's fascinating to me. I like that orderly process. And so I'm a big Gantt chart guy. And within that is the principle of chunking. Where are we now? Oh, we're in phase one. What's phase one? It's the development of access to the construction site, as an example. Phase two is getting the initial product on site so that we can begin the construction. And we go to 2 and 3, and you can see how this process works on out. What we say in the book is that process is phenomenal for the training hall. It's not so good on the real world application because the world doesn't work on a Gantt chart. Anybody that's ever made a Gantt chart, anybody that's ever made a project chart has noted that flexibility has to be part of it because you did not anticipate that wild curveball coming at you. You didn't expect this to happen. That wasn't supposed to be there. And it can be anything from a pandemic to a shortened supply. But within the training hall, when you're doing your martial arts, that doesn't exist. It is a laboratory. It's almost a sterile environment. I'm not talking about sweating and slipping and falling down and the occasional bump and bruise and accident and so forth. Those things are part of it. What I'm saying is it's sterile in the sense that oftentimes it's prearranged. The movements, the partner drills, the things that happen, so that what you can do is safely practice, repeat, and do what needs to be done to sharpen your skills. It is a form of chunking. Even though it's not identified as such, you can see it in many schools. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get warmed up. The next thing that's going to happen is we're going to do our basics. Then once we do our basics, then we're going to move to kata. Then we're going to go to free sparring. That kind of pattern. And that's kind of a classic pattern, an easy one to see. That's chunking. But punches come in bunches. They don't adhere to the Gantt chart. They don't adhere to the chunking. And one is excellent for learning. The other, fairly dangerous if you find yourself in a situation where there needs to be an application. And that's what we're saying in that particular section of the 10 rules of karate is punches come in bunches, and you should know this. And if you get a chance to train it around a little bit and be flexible, go ahead. If your partner is willing and the instructor thinks that it's a fine thing to do, or you're the instructor and you're calling it as the next thing we're doing, please do that. But as that begins to happen, we hope that what occurs is the 10 rules move from being rules of do's and don'ts, of a negative framing, like you would speak to a child. Don't do that. That's not polite. Don't do that, because the kids are expansive. They're testing everything all the time. If they're not licking a doorknob, they're pulling a cat's tail. They learn from these things. What happens is that you have a tendency to frame things in a negative frame. That's not bad. Don't take it as it's a bad thing. It's actually quite an effective way to work because it's the way the human brain works. It works on negative reinforcement. Think danger, that kind of thing. Those things get wired into the brain quite quickly. Things that are a little more soft, a little less specific, those require a different approach. So when we look at these 10 rules, I would hope that you wouldn't look at them in this way, that you wouldn't look at them as a negative enforcement. When we say punches come in bunches, that's a positive. That's a positive acknowledgement. It's not a, hey, don't stand there like that because punches are going to keep coming and you're going to get a lot of them, and don't do that and do this and shift. Or it's not that way. Because the 10 rules, and they can be Funakoshi's rules too, or they could be orders of conduct, say, of a fraternal organization or a sorority or whatever it might be. You want to look at them as entry points, not restrictors. And although admittedly framed often in the negative, don't look at it that way. You should look at it as what replaces this? What steps into this if I'm not supposed to do this, or there's an acknowledgement of a situation, a lot of punches are coming my way. Question is, how do you deal with that? Then you see it becomes an entry point. It's an acknowledgement of a situation, and it allows you to hopefully begin to test, explore, just like that young child, licking the doorknob and pulling the cattail. You get a chance to kind of explore some things and say, oh, that doesn't work. Oh, this works. And of course, I'm going to argue that those answers lie in your kata. That's just default position. It doesn't mean you can't augment it. Doesn't mean you can't add to it or take away from it or insert something or delete something. But it does mean that that kata is that textbook. And it's a place to refer to most of these things in almost any instance. So to look at it and say, how's Pion Yodan handle that? And is it the appropriate thing to handle it? Or how does this technique from Aikido or whatever? That's up to you. That's not a rule that comes your way, because the rule can't sustain the enemy incursion. The rules don't really always save you. Principles, on the other hand, that's a different deal. Principles have great malleability. They are something that can go from here to here to here. As an example, the truths that are found in Funakoshi's 20 precepts and some of the writings of the Stoics, they align, they work. The adventure begins not with the closure of don't do this, don't do that, but it begins with the understanding that the rules, and in this instance, the 10 rules of karate, are entry points and not raps on the back of the hand. It's a point of entry, a way to shape how you see a situation from a principle-based approach. My hope is that you didn't find this to be an infomercial for the book. Now, if you want to pick it up, hey, I love you for it, please do. But you can find the principles that are in your system through observation, through study, and good communication. Or if you're lucky, your founder wrote a couple things down. You get a chance to lean into their experience, and boy, that's a great place to start, isn't it? I want to leave you with this last thought when you're looking at the 10 rules. And that is, we wrote it to be an entry point and not restrictions. Your art is your art. However you want to construct that, once you've got your basics down, got some time underneath your belt, you've got some experience and you've had some time and some maturity, it's kind of up to you to make it an art. I mean, it's art, isn't it? Martial arts. Now, I'm not saying that you go crazy. I mean, that's not at all what I'm saying. But I am saying that you move differently than I do. And the next person, and the next person, and the next person. Physical differences make a big gap between people's behaviors, let alone their brain type and how they see the world or what their experience has been. All of these things bear weight on that entry point.